Woo! Good morning, beautiful people. I'm Babz Rawls-Ivy. Welcome to LoveBabz, LoveTalk. The wheels do indeed keep turning. Happy Wednesday. I am delighted today to have Robert Sanders talking to me today. He holds a doctorate of law policy.
Law and policy.
Law and policy degree, a Juris Doctorate degree, a master's in law, and about three other master's degrees. He is the chair of the National Security for the Henry C. Lee College of Criminal Justice and Forensic Science, just up the street from us at University of New Haven. And so I thought we would talk about, because he is expert in talking about lawsuits against China with precedents and the role of the National Guard and the military during the pandemic, which I don't think, as we were having this conversation, and welcome, Mr. Sanders.
Good morning, doctor. How you doing?
I'm so happy to have you here, Dr. Sanders. I don't think we talk about the pandemic outside of the health ramifications.
Right.
I don't think we're having a conversation other than if you have symptoms. We're not talking about everything else that is overarching that affects us because of this pandemic. So that's why you're here today, so that we can have these conversations, so that people can expand their awareness of what's happening with this pandemic.
Glad to be here. There's one of the things I'd like to just lay out as a basic thing. We talk about national security. National security is not just the military. There's a whole lot of other pieces to it. Matter of fact, when we talk about it and when we teach it, we talk about it in an acronym called the DIMEFIL. DIMEFIL.
Mm-hmm.
D is diplomacy, the I is information, the M is military, E is economics, F is finance, the second I is intelligence, and the last one is law, legal. And those are the instruments of power, the national instruments of power that the United States and all nations utilize in order to do positive and negative things for ourselves and or against an adversary. And when we think about national security, we focus on the M, focus on the military. But there's lots of other parts of national security. For instance, within the M, but also outside of the M, there's climate change. And as our climate changes, that's a national security threat. For the military, places like Norfolk, Virginia, which is the largest US naval base, the water's rising. Well, if the water rises and covers the piers, you can't use the ships.
Really?
Bad problem. We start thinking about, we need to think about the fact that the coronavirus, an infection, is a national security problem. Because one, the military can't function. You saw what happened to the aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt and a couple of other ships who had outbreaks. They became unable to complete their missions. That's reminiscent of what happened in the influenza outbreaks of 1918, when we had 40,000+ soldiers unable.
So, Dr. Sanders, if the military is sick, in large numbers, that is a real problem.
It is a real problem. And one of the reasons we found out about this Chinese outbreak, coronavirus, was there's an intelligence unit in the United States military based on a base out in the south of the US and in the west of the US. And they're a medical intelligence unit. Their job is to think about, seek, investigate, and uncover medical threats to the United States, but in particular to the United States military. And so the United States military can operate. So when I go someplace, I spent 34 years as an active duty military member. I was a judge advocate for over 30 years, and I was an intelligence specialist before that when I was an enlisted sailor. And in order to go places, we need to know what threatens us there. So if I was going to go to the Congo, which I did 8 times, or to the Liberia or Sierra Leone, I would meet with medical beforehand, before I would take my team in the country, and find out what my medical threats were and be vaccinated for those things if there's a vaccination before we left the United States. That unit also looks at not just the threats that are natural, because there are natural threats and then there are man-made or human threats in the threat category, and where they come from, who they are, why they might be there. So there's a lot to unpack in this concept of national security that isn't just straight bang and boom, kinetic arms and engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And the nation needs to start thinking differently about these things. In the planning stages for our national security, we do this thing called the 2+2+1. The first two, 1 and 2, essentially, are Russia and China, potential adversaries. The second +2 is Iran and North Korea. And then the +1 is everything else, climate change.
So you do know, Dr. Sanders, that all those countries and the heads of those countries you just named are boys with our sitting president. Like they have a good, they enjoy a bromance at the moment.
I think that's problematic. I think when I was born, Russia and communist China were the enemies of the United States. I think when I pass, hopefully many, many years from now, that will remain the case.
Because they're not our allies.
They're not our allies. They don't wish us well. And they love our money and our technology and aspects of our lifestyle. But they want those things for themselves, for their own utilization, not for our benefit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. I just wanted to point that out, that the countries that you mentioned seem to be the countries that the sitting president currently enjoys entertaining and parading as strong leadership.
Well, he has an affinity toward authoritarian types. Mm-hmm. And those 4 countries have authoritarian structures, not the democratic structures that we not always are capable of upholding in this country, but at least idealize, aspire to.
Yeah. All right. So go on with your talk around the threats.
So when we think about the threats that we're really focused on, we spend a lot of time focusing on the M. I think what the coronavirus has done has expanded that, where we had 2+2+1. Maybe that's less than 2 on that first part of that, and that 1 is now 1.5, because there needs to be, out of that $750 million military budget, a greater and broader focus on some of these non-kinetic, not the things that go boom and bang, problems, concerns, what the military calls threats to our nation.
And so why are we so reluctant to understand anything outside of military, the bang and the boom? That why are we so interested and invested in the big things, but not so, or maybe it's just in this administration, but not invested in just what you were talking about. Like if another country is sick, we need to know if they're sick, because that has real ramifications for us.
It does. And one of the things about planning in the national security environment is a lot of times you plan for what you know. What you know is what you've just seen, or who you just fought, or how you just fought. So after 9/11, our focus shifted to terrorism, international terrorism, mostly born out of Muslim countries or Islamic states in North Africa or what we call the Middle East. So we did that because that's where the threat came. That's what loomed large. That's what people saw. And the focus became that. Well, if you listen to the FBI director and others, there's still a major national security threat from terrorism, but it's not international. It's homegrown. It's
Mm.
extremist. It's white supremacists, Nazis, supporters or sympathizers, and the like ilk. If you look at the numbers of people killed in terrorist attacks in the United States, it's not in the last multiple years. Those numbers are not international terrorist victims. Those numbers are homegrown extremist terrorist victims.
Hmm. And
Um,
so, and we don't spend a whole lot of time pointing the finger at that.
we don't. You can go back to your president in some ways, but we also need to think about the fact that threats emerge and decline. And as a defender against those threats, you need to adjust. And how you adjust is based on the intelligence you have. And how do you get intelligence? Well, you got to fund those things too. And you have to fund the people who are going to look at what you don't see as a problem today, which may be a problem tomorrow. Uh,
Mm.
Long vision is what you have to have, as well as the short vision. So in the military sense, we talked about it as strategic planning and strategic intelligence, the years out looking, versus the operational, which is the months to few years out, down to tactical, which is from right now to a couple of weeks from now. And we need to do all of that simultaneously. And we need to do it in other ways than just what we used to do, which is the 2+2+1. That one has to grow somehow, some way, so that we expand what we think about as national security.
So when we think about this COVID-19 as a security threat issue, and we are now coming to understand that this is a man-made virus of some sort, at least
Well, I
that's
think that's still debatable. You know,
well, okay, but
scientists say that it is a natural threat that emerged in bats that then took a second step and jumped to humans. Now, so that's the public intelligence. Is there private intelligence that says more? I don't know. But if we accept the public intelligence and what the scientists are saying out front, we still need to prepare ourselves for defenses against those type of things. And let's take it to another step. So what if you want to weaponize it? Yes, it wasn't made in a lab as a weapon, but what if you decide to take it from nature and make it a weapon? You know, that's another
see
threat.
that's I think that's the next level of terrorism for me.
Well, it's
That
already happened.
kind of, I mean, yeah, it's already happening, but we're not speaking about it in. I mean, right now we're speaking about it in ways of, sort of like conspiracy theorist kinds of things. We're not talking about, at least normal everyday people are not talking about it in a factual sort of this is happening. We're talking about it in a very fiction driven,
Yeah,
movie-esque Mission Impossible kind of James Bond way.
yeah.
Uh,
We tell our students at the National Security Department at University of New Haven that those movies, for the most part, aren't real.
aren't
Uh,
real? Aren't real.
aren't for the most part. Now there are aspects. There are Navy SEALs who did kill Bin Laden and did run around in the woods and in the mountains of Afghanistan, mountains that I walked around when I served there, and they took it to fight to him in a Mission Impossible way. That's true. Those things happen, but a lot of that other stuff is not what the normal day-to-day intelligence professional or analyst is going to do. Military folks, we call the tooth and the tail. The tail is all that stuff that supports. I was a lawyer, so I was more supportive, but I did operational things, so I did it with the tooth, which are the warfighters, the people who are carrying weapons. I carried one as well, but the people who are carrying weapons going forward to engage the enemy. I was there if the enemy came to me, I could defend myself, but there's a different perspective. So those things are real. Those things are happening, but that's not all that is happening. There's more. And, you know, when I talked about those instruments of national security, you don't just defend yourself with the M, you defend yourself with the D. When you have friends and your friends say to you, hey, you know, you need to look out and watch out for, because you have a diplomatic relationship with your friend and your friend has your interest and their own in mind, they tell you things. They have, you have people who work on the information, so the eyepiece. So rather than listen to what China has to say about coronavirus, maybe somebody will tell you something else, which is real and relevant. You have the E. They have an economy. Their economy was shut down. Our economy was shut down. Well, maybe if we knew more I information, we would have been better to protect our E, our economy, from what they were doing that was detrimental, i.e., not doing the things that should have been doing to keep that virus from jumping from animals to people. And then go right down the line to all of that, to the last one, with my favorite, of course, the L, the law. Well, how do you deal with this? You know, one of the things you wanted to talk about today was the lawsuits. You know, we can spend a lot of time trying to crack the concept called sovereign immunity, which states, nation states, are immune from suit by other nation states. It's an international concept that all states adhere to. Well, we have legislation right now in the Senate. I don't know if it's a comparable bill yet in the House, but in the Senate, that would remove, under the Sovereign Immunities Act, some of China's sovereign immunity to allow the state level attorney generals of states and these individual lawsuits to go forward and potentially bear fruit. It's a long way to get there, but people are thinking about that.
Is that what we want? Is that in our best interest to do that?
Well, that's the exact point. Be careful what you wish for, because on the other side of the table, we have sovereign immunity in China. Does that get adjusted and revoked in retaliation and response? I would bet money on it if we do that.
Yeah, I would bet money too.
And what's the goal? What's the goal here? What are we trying to do? We're trying to fix the F, the finance, and the E, and make the people who were hurt by this whole. You can never bring back loved ones. So that's one part of this that can't be fixed. But when people sue people, the way you make them whole again is you take money from the loser and give it to the winner in the lawsuit. So all of these lawsuits, that's their goal. The first part of the goal is to find China responsible, and the second part is to make them pay monetarily.
But we owe them a lot of money, like they
yeah, we owe them money because we're in a deficit trade war with them. But why spend all that money and effort that right now is a losing proposition because the laws of the United States don't support you winning? How about we do this? How about we think about a different concept? Think about South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and think about the commission that was set up after 9/11 and the fund to pay the victims. What if we just got China to say it originated in our country and that was a bad thing? And we accept that it originated in our country was a bad thing. Got it. That's the first part of recognition that they did it. Second thing is, and oh, by the way, we, China, we're going to set up a fund, worldwide claims fund, with all that extra money that they have, that everybody who was hurt, not corporations, but individuals, could file a claim. And nonpartisan, non-Chinese, UN probably directed entity would do the same thing that was done in New York City, receive the claims, evaluate claims, and give a modicum of responsive money
Hmm.
to the claimants.
Oh
Well,
boy.
China was the major funder of this, and other countries would kick in as well, but China would be the major funder.
uh how
But
likely is are the
it's,
Chinese even amenable to that kind of thinking?
I don't know if anybody's asked China. I sure know that we've tried to make and establish lawsuits against China that right now go nowhere because the laws don't support them.
Hmm.
What about doing something where we're not wasting time and money? Maybe the diplomatic aspect of this can engage and try to bring that around, bring the rest of the world to that idea and push China to that point where China's going to pay out the money and it'll be voluntary versus the fight in the lawsuit that right now you can't win.
Hmm. So, doctor, talk a little bit about. I am fascinated by this COVID as a security risk, as a security breach, as a security concern. Um, how are we behaving in a way that allows us to be prepared for the beginning of this kind of ongoing experience?
Well, you have to go back to the younger President Bush to fully lay out this process and the considerations behind it. So he read a book about the influenza pandemic of 1918. And immediately after finishing that book, he called together national security advisors and others and said, hey, this thing can happen to us. We need to do something about it. And they put together a team in younger Bush's White House to address these things. They started putting together a playbook, what we should do when this happens, who needs to be in the game as actors, HHS, Health and Human Services, the military, surgeon generals, etc., governors of states, all of that, laying all of that out, put it all together, and passed it forward. The Obama administration had it, worked with it for a while, but for whatever reason, changed courses for a minute and didn't do all of the things that the Bushies had said. And then Ebola hit. And President Obama got a stark wake up call that
Hmm.
this was really possible and it really needed to be funded and addressed. And the Obama administration jumped back in and doubled down to set up the response plan for this. They built a new playbook, built a new office in the National Security Council, staffed it, and their function was to prepare us for a pandemic. And it's interesting if you ever look back at the speeches when George W. Bush made his announcement in 2005 that he was going to do this, the speech he made rolls right up the street for what we're dealing today. And then in 2014, when President Obama made his announcement, he said 5 years or something from now, we may have a pandemic. It was
Mm.
almost 5 years exactly from when he made that speech to when this happened in Wuhan, China. So uh, there's a long road to getting where we're at. And at the end of the day, the Trump administration then took all of that.
And toss it in the garbage?
In part, they took the office that was solely responsible for this in the National Security Council, and they took all those staffers, they pulled them out and put them into another office that had another primary mission. So now that office had a primary mission and a secondary mission, and the secondary mission was pandemic. Took the primary issue for pandemic as a responsibility and pushed it over to the Health and Human Services secretary without staff, without funding, without the same expertise. and said, okay, you got this now, and go ahead. So when this hit in December, and our CDC was asking the Chinese, and the Chinese were saying, no, we have nothing to tell you. When the World Health Organization was asking the Chinese, oh, we have nothing to tell you. The leadership of the US government in this area, Dr. Fauci, Secretary of the Secretary of HHS, the Secretary the Director of the CDC, Director of the Virus Control, FEMA, and another individual. They were literally just going to the offices of HHS and having meetings to figure out what to do. The playbook said that the National Security Council would stand up a task force from all of government, bring all these people together, figure out what each person's mission was to prepare us to take on this pandemic. That went away with what the Trump organization did. So that's the first problem. And then I think a week ago they said they came in ill prepared and there was no information. They had a 60+ page playbook that the Obama administration handed them the day they went out on what to do when the pandemic, because it's coming, comes.
Mm-hmm. So now pandemic is part of our lexicon. We can't go back to a time when this does not exist. There'll be another one, there'll be another one, there'll be another one. I don't think we're not going back to the romance days of what could happen. It is happening.
Correct. I agree.
So talk about the role of the National Guard, because we're starting to hear these conversations around, we want people to shelter in place. They're not going to shelter in place. Is this something that you use the National Guard for, the Reserve? Like, how do you police? How do you use your military on your own people? Do you do that?
That's a very difficult and extremely relevant concern. So if you think about this from a constitutional perspective, so think about the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights, which says you have freedom of assembly and freedom of speech. Think about the Second Amendment, which says you have the right to bear arms. Think about the Fourth Amendment, which says you are free from search and seizure. And then the 10th Amendment, which gives the governors powers that are not specifically enumerated or given in writing to the federal government or implied through the writing of the Constitution to the federal government. Everything else is left to the state government and the governor and the state constitution. So from the first one, I have the right to speak and say things. They can be wrong and frankly stupid, but I have a right to say those things. And that it's within the Constitution. I also have a right to assemble, but both of those rights can be limited. You can't run into a movie theater and shout fire. You can't defame people either in writing or in language, because both of those are actionable and you can be sued for those things. In some countries, those are actually crimes. In Italy, that's a crime. And you have a right to assemble. We can all get together and talk, but there's a limit on that too, right? When you can't have a riot, that's an assembly. You can't go into certain restricted areas just because you want to, and you have a First Amendment right to assemble. So the government has a duty and responsibility to look at those rights and manage them for the best of the country. And the Supreme Court, as the arbiter of this, has to look at these things and say, well, your right is not outweighed by the public need or good. And so you can't have that right. We're going to curtail it or maybe even take it away from you. So you can't say those things and you can't go that place. So that's the first one. Second one, Second Amendment, you have the right to bear arms. Well, yeah, you do. But when you show up at a state house with long weapons to complain that the governor is not letting you do the first one, which is assemble without a mask or in any other sense, that's problematic. I think that's problematic. Even in these open carry states, I think that's problematic. Now, how did we get to these laws? Well, we got to these laws because the Black Panthers invaded California Assembly, and it was
And, you
me.
know, it's so funny that I just did a show on the Black Panthers, and that whole they marched down the state capitol with their long
and,
guns, long
and
firearms,
Ronald Reagan,
and Ronald
changed
Reagan
the
went
law.
crazy.
Ronald Reagan went crazy, changed the law, and
Mhm.
so the right to bear arms in California was curtailed. You couldn't bear arms in the assembly anymore. So we have restrictions on these constitutional rights for reasons, some good, some questionable, some not so good, but they're there. And then the Fourth Amendment. So search and seizure. I don't want to wear a mask. I want to go someplace. I want to be free in my person. Well, maybe you can do that if it's not a danger to everyone else.
Mm.
And maybe we need to have laws, rules, regulations, and restrictions that reduce the danger to everyone else. Just because you want to exercise your law, your rights under those laws in a manner that under these circumstances may be extreme, because now you are the danger.
Mhm.
You create the danger, and it's the government's responsibility to address that. And last one, to the 10th one. Well, the government that we're usually talking about in these instances is the state government, is the police powers of the governor. And I say police powers, I don't just mean, the blue line, the cops. I mean, his powers to do things like make criminal laws in the state, make laws on the highways, uh, divide up zoning, those type of policing powers of the state. They include to take people's temperatures when they come into a building, if that was what needed to be done. They include stopping cars as they cross your state border. And if they have an out-of-state plate, say, where you going, what are you doing? And if you're going to stay here, you have to be quarantined for 14 days before you can go out. And if you don't do that, there's an executive order in place that says there's a fine. And then after the fine, there may be incarceration.
Mm.
Those are what state governors have done. And they've done that under their state constitutions. And those state constitutions and they're empowered to do that under the US Constitution, under the 10th Amendment to the Bill of Rights, which gives.
But Dr. Sanders, as long as if this pandemic goes on longer, do you foresee people getting locked up?
I guess it really depends on the circumstances. So if we have a second wave,
Which we will.
which we will, and we have a certain number of people who are not adhering, so that the second wave cannot be broken, abridged, or controlled, governors may have to reach into that bag of police powers, excuse me, to act for the good of the whole versus the few who object.
Hmm.
That's extreme, because now we're in the not just legal, now we're in political. So what do you do if you're a politician? You
What do
don't,
you do if you're the governor of Wisconsin?
well, you don't want have your constituency upset and in revolt. You want them behind you, right, and supporting you. So where do you draw the line between your duty as an elected official and your role as a politician? I think the probably the latest, greatest big example of that was Mitt Romney in
Mm.
the impeachment hearings. He viewed his role as a senator of the United States. As a senator of the United States, he saw the president of the United States to be wrong in certain ways and not in others. And in the ways he found him wrong, he voted for the impeachment bill that had been presented. In the ways he didn't, he voted the other way. John McCain's another one. When Obamacare came up, he was a senator for the United States, and that was not a good bill for the United States as a senator, whereas may have been a good bill for his political party as a Republican.
So how should we, Dr. Sanders, how should we be thinking about this as intelligent seeking people? How do we put away our fears and think about this rationally on how to move forward? The pandemic way of life is with us now.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be with us now. We have designer masks now. We're not going to go back to where there'll be no mask. Givenchy is going to have masks as part of their fall 2020.
I got a note from a friend who is a haberdasher in Newport, Rhode Island, with his new Italian silk mask available.
Masks are here to stay as a new fashion accessory. I mean, they're here. So how should we, what do you suggest that we as everyday, ordinary American citizens, or citizens of the world, how should we plan, think, move forward with this realness of pandemic?
Listen to the scientists. Most of them, there's a few who have an axe to grind or a position, like the woman who just put out this movie that everybody was all up in arms about a week or two ago. But most of the scientists, the Faucis of the world, the Dr. Faucis of the world, are in this for our good. So what are they telling us to do? Well, we should probably do that. We should probably follow their lead and the road that they're putting us on, because they're not running for office. They're not trying to gain financially or politically from this. They're in it for our well-being and best interests. So I think we need to look at those type of people, measure what is being said, what's the second order effect of opening their mouth and telling you to do X or Y. And if the second order effect is you're going to be better for it, they're not going to be richer for it, or they're not going to be in better state with the community. Matter of fact, some people are going to not be happy that they've said what they said, but it's the right thing to say. Those might be the people we want to listen to and follow, and take their advice and move out in that direction.
And when we think about our military preparedness and readiness, if our military is sick, if we see large numbers of military personnel coming down with this COVID, that does not bode well for our military ability to defend us.
Well, the military had to adjust. So the training stations around the nation, they shut down. They stopped physical fitness training. There wasn't allowed. The Naval Academy, Coast Guard Academy, Air Force Academy, and West Point sent their students home. Unfortunately, the West Point is having to bring back their seniors to graduate so that the president can show them next speech. But besides that, the leaders of those organizations realized that to protect the next level line of new officers, they needed to go home, shelter in place, finish their school like my students have finished their school on Zoom or some other internet-based teaching platform, meeting platform like we are today,
Mhm.
and not be in the classroom where they could be contagious, not be out doing physical training. I mean, the U.S. Navy SEALs just restarted training last week. Now, arguably the toughest organization in the United States military shut down their training so they could get a handle on this and plan to do training in a new COVID environment. And when they finished the plan, they went back to training.
Mhm.
So, like everybody else, we need to do the same thing. What's the new plan? What do you need to do in order to do what you want to do and what you need to do? New plan.
So, we got a few seconds before you go, a few minutes before you go. Another thing that I find quite troubling, and I wish I had more time with you, and I'm gonna have you come back so we can talk about this a bit more. But you had talked about this earlier, the weaponizing of the COVID or any sort of virus of this sort, the weaponizing of that. Should we be concerned beyond conspiracy about that?
Well, we shouldn't be as individuals concerned, but the folks who's are part of the national security apparatus who have to defend against that should be very concerned. Fort Detrick, Maryland, and other places need to be and probably are working very hard on these type of issues and figuring out what do we need to do. For instance, the reason that we're probably closer to a vaccine for COVID-19 is because we had SARS and MERS. They're all in the same family of viruses. And when I was sending teams and going with teams into the Middle East and bringing students to my schoolhouse from the Middle East, we had concerns from students from Asia and students from the Middle East, from SARS and MERS. And as a result of that, we had to have protocols. So, what type of testing do they have to go through before they can come to my schoolhouse in America? What do I need to do with my folks who I'm sending to their country to teach? How do we need to be prepared? We just need to do that, and that needs to filter down into the regular population to the extent that we need to be ready, willing, and able to deal with these things should they happen. But at the national security level, I'm 110% sure there are individuals who are working very hard at trying to figure out these things right now and how to correspond to weaponization of these things, as well as the fact that we need broad-based type vaccines that not are just for the military but for the regular citizens of the United States.
Mm. So when you are teaching your students and you see what is going on across the country right now with people protesting against their own interests, against their own health, what do you say? How do you have you ever in your life seen anything quite like this?
Um,
Because your experiences are unique. You're
yeah,
you've
I
got a
can't
lot of
say
experience
that
around the
I've
globe.
I'd have to think about that for a minute. That I've seen people so adamantly protesting against their own interests, um, with what I presume to be knowledge that they're protesting against. Uh, but what I tell my students is, okay, let's think this through. Let's think about this. We do a thing in national security and the military called ends, ways, means, and risks. So ends are goals. What are you trying to do? Where are you trying to be? And you start from that and you work backwards. So I start with my goal. That's where I want to be. Well, what are the ways that I can get here? Well, I have a bunch of lines of effort, LOEs, of how I can get to that goal. What are the means that each of those lines of effort require? So, do I need trucks? Do I need gas? Do I need boots? Do I need soldiers? Do I need computers? Do I need money? And do I have those things? So where am I starting from? And then last, what are the risks of my ways? What are the risks to my means? And how do I account for those as I try to get myself to my goal? And then and then you do a line back to your goal again, because along the way, as you do your ways, your means, you will encounter these risks and they will change what you have to do. So you come all the way back again to your beginning and decide that that's still where you want to be. And you start working back through that same sequence over and over again to try to get to an end state that you want. Sometimes it's a political end state, sometimes it's a military end state.
It has been a pleasure talking to you, Dr. Sanders. I hope that you could come on again. I'd like to talk to you down the road to see where we are, to take the temperature again of where we are with this pandemic. Because I think this is a game changer for the country, and I would imagine that the election will usher in a different kind of administration so that we don't feel so vulnerable.
Well, there's two options. So we have a new administration that brings different ideas and thoughts, or we have the continuance of this one on the road that we're on.
Yeah.
So
thank you. So Dr. Sanders is my guest today. Dr. Robert Sanders is my guest today. He's the chair of the National Security from the Henry C. Lee College of Criminal Justice and Forensic Sciences at the University of New Haven. I thank you, and we will be in touch. Thank you, Harry.
Take care. See you, Harry.
Ah.